Hey guys, today I'm doing a power jack replacement on an Acer Aspire Vero 15 laptop. This laptop came in with a loose power connection where you plug in the power cord. You can kind of wiggle it around to make it charge. And if you just wiggle it around in just the right way, it'll kind of go in and out from the battery back to power, and the power jack needs to be replaced on the motherboard. So to start it off here, I'm going to remove the bottom cover. All these bottom screws need to come off, and then the whole bottom cover plate will be removed. And once all these screws are removed, I'm going to take a little guitar pick and kind of run it along the edge of the bottom plate just to pry up the little tab connectors there that keep that in place. But you can use any pry tool that works for you. I like these little thin guitar picks. They work pretty nice to get in there because those edges in between the bottom cover are pretty small. Or the gap rather in between the chassis and the bottom cover. And once you get it kind of pried up in one spot, you can use your hand like I'm doing to lift it up a little bit. I think I just sliced my hand open there. They're really sharp underneath, so you gotta be careful. Alright, so now that bottom cover is off and everything needs to be removed for the most part to get to the motherboard. The first thing I like to do with these laptops is try to remove the battery first if possible. There's always a chance it's in standby or something from the battery power, so make sure you disconnect that battery before you do anything else. And there's a couple screws that hold this battery into place, so they need to be removed, and then the battery will come right out. And once that battery is removed, I'm removing the SSD drive here. It's a single screw that holds it into place, and then it kind of goes up, and you can just remove that hard drive. And there I just removed the cable for the I/O board. And now I'm going to remove the wireless leads for the Wi-Fi card. And next I'm just going to remove detach the fan connections. And now I'm going to detach the touchpad and the keyboard and the backlight. And there's a couple other cable connectors there too that need to be removed. And here I'm going to detach the speaker. And here I'm going to detach the video cable. And here I'm going to unscrew one of the sides where the hinge is. The hinge is kind of laying over the motherboard, so I detach the screws, I lift it up a little bit to give a little bit of space in between there, and then I can take my thumb and pry that hinge up. And next I'm going to remove the fans. And there's some tape that's holding the cables together there, so I'm just removing that tape and getting the fan all the way off. And now I'm removing the other fan cable and the fan. And here I'm prying up the CMOS battery because it's stuck to with some glue. or adhesive. And then there's a single screw that holds the motherboard in. And once you remove that screw, now the motherboard can come up. And you can see the little yellow power jack here. There's no real indicator that it's bad, but it's just very loose when you plug it in. And that's just a little connection that's soldered to the motherboard. So get that motherboard out, and then we'll desolder that power jack. Alright, so here we are with the power jack removal. And this is kind of the long, hard part. It takes a little bit of work to get this thing desoldered and removed. It's definitely the most difficult part of the repair. It's where a lot of people get stuck. And you kind of have to have some decent desoldering, removal skills and the correct tools as well. So my technique, I like to add some flux. I really like to get these through holes nice and heated up, and it makes the removal process much easier. And after I add that flux, I like to add some fresh solder. This is a little bit counterintuitive, but what I'm doing here is I'm just getting these through holes nice and heated up and getting all that solder kind of melted and ready to be removed. If you just have the old existing solder in there, it doesn't really want to come up very well. If you do it without the flux or do it without adding the solder, it can be just very, very difficult to get that old solder out of there. So even adding some solder and getting those through holes flowing is very helpful. So now I'm going to take the desoldering braid, or the wick, and I'm going to try to remove as much solder from each of these holes. The front two there is just some support pins, and then there's a ground and a voltage and another support pin in the back, and they're all going to need to be desoldered so we can get this jack out of here. And you just want to take that wick and go over each one of the holes, remove as much solder as you can. I like to use the air soldering gun as well. Sometimes I've noticed just over the years with these things, doing having just the desoldering braid alone is not really enough to get all the solder out of here. So we'll heat it up with some hot air and get that jack removed. But you definitely want to take as much of the solder out first. And sometimes I'm able to get it without the hot air station. I'm able to just use the wick, use the solder, adding in the flux, and get that jack removed. But sometimes some of the solder in these through holes just does not want to come up, so that's where the hot air comes in, which you'll see here shortly. Right there's a voltage pin that I'm desoldering, and now moving on to the next one. And you can also use a pump for this. I've seen people use pumps and different desoldering techniques. Whatever works for you is fine. I just prefer the braid. It's usually pretty easy. And not everyone has a soldering pump laying around. You can buy one of these solder wick braids for like $4 or $5. And as you can see there, especially with that back voltage pin, that solder is coming out pretty well. But when you're removing the jack and you're doing the desoldering, you never want to force it out. You don't want to hold the soldering iron on there too long. You just want to get as much of it out as possible. I use a Hako FX888D soldering iron and with a chisel tip, and it works pretty well. Sometimes the soldering irons will come with a pointy tip, and that doesn't work too well. You need more of like a chisel tip or what looks like kind of like a flathead. And so here I'm just taking some 99% alcohol and just cleaning up the excess flux. And here I'm putting some thermal tape over the sensitive components. I'm going to do the air soldering just to do the final removal here. And now I'm taking the hot air and just dispersing it over the through holes, trying to heat this board up. And this will help me, now that I've had the solder partially removed, this will really help get it out of there pretty quickly. I typically run this thing around 400 degrees for the hot air, and the soldering iron I typically run around 750, pretty typical temperatures. And I have the tweezers in the other hand kind of ready to catch that thing when it's going to fall out. The hot air is just going to depend on the thickness of the motherboard and how much solder is left in there, and and the size of the jack. This is kind of a smaller one, so they're a little bit easier to use with the hot air. There's some other Acer models, like their gaming ones, that take me up to 15 minutes with the hot air to get it out, because it's such a thick motherboard. This Acer Vero 15 is pretty thin board, pretty small jack, so it's a little bit easier to get out with the hot air. And I'm holding it roughly about ½ an inch to an inch away from the board. That's typically what I keep it at. You don't want to get that too close. And there we go. The jack is removed. It's pretty quick for that one. And the next part of the process here is just to remove the existing solder that's still in those through holes. There's still some in there when you pull that jack out, so I'm going to do the same technique as before, add some flux, do some desoldering with the braid again. As you can see, that solder's coming up pretty nicely. You can see through that through hole pretty well. But you want to get as much of it out of there as possible. If there's not enough solder removed and you try to put it in the new jack, it kind of catches and just doesn't want to go in, and definitely doesn't want to go in at the correct angle. You want to make sure you get out as much of that solder out as possible. And sometimes if I can't get the solder out, I'll even, just like I did in the first beginning of the desoldering part, I'll add some solder to it, add some more flux, just to get that through hole nice and hot. That really helps get that solder removed. And here I'm just taking my tweezers, and there's some solder that just, for whatever reason, just does not want to come out sometimes. Doesn't matter how much desoldering braid you try to use, it just does not want to come out of there. So sometimes I'll take that tweezer with that sharp end and I'll kind of, poke it around just to push it up a little bit, get it removed. And what I did here too is I just flipped the motherboard over, and I'm going to try to desolder it from the other side. That's like another technique that can help. And just to make sure you add some more flux when you're using that braid. Just makes that solder come out so much easier with the flux pen. So now I got the new jack here. I'm going to put that thing in. Make sure you put it in the right way. And when you have enough of that solder removed, it should kind of snap in there nicely. And you want to make sure it's level. I'm taking these pliers here, or these cutters rather, and I'm just putting it under the jack so I keep that jack kind of flush with the motherboard. If I were to just let it go, it would kind of fall to the side, or not be level with the motherboard, and those pins would kind of dip down. So I put that under there to kind of stabilize it. And here I'm just adding some more flux again when I do the resoldering. The flux is great. It'll help it flow through those through holes properly and make a good connection. And now I'm just going to add solder to each one of these holes. And you just want to hold that soldering iron on there. Make sure you get the solder to flow through from the top to the bottom to the other side. Sorry to cover up the camera here, I'm just doing the last through hole there. So there we go, that new jack is nice and soldered in there. I'm going to take some more of that alcohol, just clean that flux off of there, make it look nice. And remove that thermal tape. And as you can see here, we got a nice new jack installation. Everything's looking good. Got a nice clean connection there. And this thing's ready to reinstall into the computer again. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comment section below.